February 14, 1984. Musicland Studios, Munich. 4 a.m. The tape machines were still rolling a technical oversight that would capture the most honest 30 minutes of Queen's life. What the engineer would discover the next morning wasn't music. It was the sound of four friends finally admitting they were breaking. And at the center of it all was Freddie Mercury, standing at a window overlooking the frozen German street, saying 5 words that would change everything. Tonight the music stops. This is the story of the night Queen almost ended, not with a dramatic explosion, but with exhaustion so profound it felt like drowning. The air inside Musicland Studios in Munich didn't feel like the birthplace of hits. It felt like a tomb. It was early 1984, and for the four members of Queen, the German winter was less a season and more a psychological state. Outside, Munich was draped in relentless gray, endless overcast skies that seemed to press down on the city like a concrete ceiling. Inside the studio's basement rooms, the air was thick with the scent of stale cigarettes, expensive vodka, and the jagged electricity of four men who had spent too many years breathing the same oxygen. They'd been here for months. Months of 16-hour days trying to record what would become the Works album. Months of perfectionism grinding against perfectionism, of four brilliant artists who'd forgotten how to compromise, who'd forgotten somewhere along the journey from struggling unknowns to stadium gods how to enjoy making music together. The studio itself was legendary. Built beneath a department store on Munich's Arabellastrasse, Musicland had hosted everyone from the Rolling Stones to Electric Light Orchestra. Its basement location meant no windows, no natural light, no sense of time passing except for the clocks that ticked relentlessly toward deadlines that kept getting extended because nothing felt right. Freddie Mercury sat at the grand piano, but his hands weren't moving. He wasn't the strutting peacock of Wembley here, wasn't the flamboyant showman who commanded stadiums with a gesture. He was a man in a white tank top, shadows deepening under his eyes, staring at a blank sheet of manuscript paper as if it were a personal insult. His appearance had changed dramatically over the past few years. Gone was the long flowing hair of the 1970s. Now he wore his hair short, cropped close to his head in the style he'd maintained for the rest of his life. His thick, dark mustache, the defining feature of 1980s, Freddie framed a mouth set in a tight line of frustration. He looked exhausted. They all did. The friction that had once fueled their creativity, the productive tension between Brian's technical perfectionism and Freddie's theatrical instincts, between Roger's raw energy and John's grounding presence, had turned into something else, into a slow, grinding erosion that was wearing all of them down to nothing. Again, Brian May's voice came through the studio monitors, thin and sharp with barely contained frustration. "The timing is off, Fred. You're rushing the bridge." Freddie didn't look up. He didn't erupt in his usual theatrical flair, didn't turn the critique into performance. He simply let out a breath that sounded like a tire losing air, a sound of complete deflation. "Maybe I'm rushing because I want to be anywhere but here, Brian," he said quietly. "Have you considered that?" The silence that followed was louder than any drum fill Roger Taylor had ever played. Roger sat behind his kit, his sticks resting idle in his lap, watching the two pillars of the band face off through the reinforced glass that separated the control room from the live room. His blonde hair was disheveled from running his hands through it repeatedly, a nervous gesture he'd developed over months of tension. His usual confident energy had been replaced by wary exhaustion. John Deacon, always the barometer of the group's soul, the quiet one who could read the room better than anyone, simply looked at the floor. His bass guitar leaned against an amp like a discarded toy, forgotten in the escalating emotional warfare. Brian May stood in the control room, his signature white curly hair catching the dim studio lights. His face was drawn, tight with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from months of creative frustration. His arms were crossed defensively, his jaw set. He looked like a man who'd been trying to hold something together through sheer force of will and was finally running out of strength. "We're losing it," Freddie whispered so quietly the sensitive microphones barely caught it. But in the tomb-like silence of the studio, everyone heard. "Losing what?" Brian asked, his voice carefully controlled. He stepped through the heavy soundproof door from the control room into the live room, the door clicking shut behind him with the finality of a prison cell. "The joy, darling, the point of it all," Freddie said, finally looking up from the blank manuscript paper. When his eyes met Brian's, there was something raw there, something vulnerable that Freddie rarely let anyone see. "Look at us," he continued, gesturing around the expensive studio with its state-of-the-art equipment and oppressive basement walls. "We're four millionaires arguing over a semi-quaver while the world waits for us to be queen. But I don't feel like a king anymore, Brian. I feel like a machine that everyone keeps winding up and expecting to perform on command." He stood up from the piano bench, his movements stiff and weary. He was 37 years old, but moved like someone much older, someone carrying weight that had nothing to do with physical years. He walked over to a bottle of Stolichnaya vodka sitting on a speaker cabinet, one of several bottles scattered around the studio, evidence of how they'd been coping with the pressure, and poured himself a glass with a hand that trembled slightly. "We need a break," Roger said from the back of the room, finally speaking up. His voice was gentle, careful, as if addressing someone on a ledge. "We're burning out, Fred, all of us. We need to step away for a while." "No," Freddie snapped, the old fire flickering for a second before dying again. "Burnout is for amateurs. This is something else. This is—" He paused, searching for words. "This is the end of the song." The metaphor hung in the air. In music, the end of the song is where everything resolves, where tension releases, where the journey completes. But Freddie wasn't talking about resolution. He was talking about termination. He looked at Brian, then Roger, then John, really looked at them, seeing not just his bandmates, but the three people who knew him better than almost anyone on Earth. For over a decade, they had been a four-headed monster, a singular entity that had conquered every continent, that had redefined it what rock music could be, that had created anthems that would outlive them all. But in that clinical Munich basement, surrounded by the most expensive equipment money could buy, they were just four tired men who had forgotten why they liked each other. "I'm going solo," Freddie said. The words didn't land like a bombshell. They landed like a mercy-killing inevitable, almost gentle in their finality. Brian's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, anger, and finally something like resignation. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," Freddie replied, his voice steady now, anchored by a terrifying clarity. "I need to know if I exist without you three. I need to see if Freddie Mercury is a person or just a character we all invented to sell records." Roger stood up from his drum kit, his face flushed with emotion. "That's bullshit, Fred. And you know it. We didn't invent you. You've always been exactly who you are." "Have I?" Freddie asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "I'm not sure anymore. When I look in the mirror, I see Queen's frontman. I see the mustache and the short hair and the tank tops, and I know that's what everyone expects. But underneath all of it, who am I? Farouk Bulsara? Freddie Mercury? Something in between? I don't know anymore." The argument that followed lasted until the sky began to pale with approaching dawn. The studio's basement location meant they couldn't see the sunrise, but the clock on the wall ticked past 4 a.m., then 5 a.m., marking time they should have been sleeping or recording, but instead spent circling the same territory over and over. It wasn't a fight about money or songwriting credits. It was deeper than that. It was a fight about identity, about autonomy, about what it meant to be part of something so much larger than yourself that you sometimes forgot where the band ended and you began. Brian spoke of legacy, of everything they'd built together, of the responsibility they had to the music and to the fans who'd supported them. His voice was passionate, articulate, building arguments with the same precision he brought to guitar solos. Roger spoke of loyalty, of the bond they'd forged over 13 years, of the implicit promise they'd made to each other when they decided to call themselves Queen and chase the impossible dream. His voice was raw, emotional, less structured than Brian's, but no less powerful. John said very little, which was typical, but when he did speak, his words carried weight precisely because they were so rare. "If we fall apart," he said quietly at one point, "we're just like every other band that couldn't handle success. Is that really what we want our legacy to be?" But Freddie stayed remarkably calm throughout, anchored by a clarity that was almost frightening in its certainty. "This isn't about destroying Queen," he explained, leaning against the studio wall with his arms crossed. "This is about saving myself, and maybe in the process, saving all of us from becoming caricatures of what we used to be." He pushed off from the wall and began pacing a caged animal in the windowless basement. When was the last time any of us actually enjoyed making music together? When was the last recording session that felt like creation rather than obligation? When did we become a job instead of a joy? The questions hung in the air, unanswerable because everyone knew the truth. It had been a long time. By 4 a.m., the engineers had long since gone home, assuming the band would eventually exhaust themselves and leave. But one tape machine was still rolling in the control room, a technical oversight, a forgotten switch that someone had meant to flip but hadn't in the chaos of the day's failed sessions. That tape would capture something no one intended, the most honest 30 minutes of Queen's life. On that tape, there is no music. There are only the sounds of four friends finally dropping the pretense. You can hear the clink of glasses being refilled, the strike of a lighter as someone lit another cigarette, the creak of leather as someone shifted in a chair. You can hear breathing, heavy, exhausted breathing, and occasional muttered words too quiet to distinguish. And then, around 4:15 a.m., according to the timestamp, you can hear Freddie walking back to the piano. Not to play a song, just to touch the keys, to remember what music felt like before it became work. He played a single chord, a minor seventh, that seemed to hang in the air forever, neither resolving nor fading, just existing in the space between hope and despair. "If we walk out here now," John Deacon asked quietly into that sustained chord, "do we ever come back?" It was the question everyone had been avoiding. Because the truth was, no one knew. Bands that took breaks sometimes never recovered. The momentum of fame was a fragile thing, easily broken and impossible to rebuild. Freddie let the chord fade before answering. He walked over to the small window high in the studio wall, a tiny rectangle of glass that was the room's only connection to the outside world, and looked out at the cold German street. Snow was falling steadily now, covering Munich in white silence. From where he stood, he could see the early morning workers beginning their day, normal people with normal jobs, living normal lives unburdened by the weight of being legends. Part of him envied them deeply. "I know the world expects me to be invincible," Freddie said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect space. "I know the American tours are waiting. I know the charts are calling, and the machinery of pop culture is hungry for the next anthem, the next hit, the next performance of being Queen." He turned away from the window to face his three friends, these men who'd shared everything with him, who'd been there for every triumph and every failure, who knew his secrets and his fears. "But I can't do it anymore. Not right now. Not without remembering who I am underneath the performance." "So what are you saying?" Brian asked. "You want to quit?" "No," Freddie said firmly. "I'm saying we come back when we're hungry again. When we remember why we started making music in the first place, because we loved it, because we couldn't not do it, because it was the only thing that made sense in a world that didn't make sense." He picked up his leather jacket from where it hung over a chair, slung it over his shoulder with a gesture that was pure Freddie despite his exhaustion. "But tonight," he continued, walking toward the studio door, "tonight the music stops. Just for a while. I'm tired of being a legend. I just want to be a man for a while. Is that really so terrible?" He paused at the threshold, his hand on the door handle, looking back at the three men who knew his secrets better than anyone on earth. They looked destroyed. Brian's face was tight with barely suppressed emotion. Roger was crying openly, not bothering to hide it. John's expression was unreadable, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "Don't look so tragic, darlings," Freddie said with a faint, bittersweet smile, the first genuine smile any of them had seen from him in weeks. "It's just a long intermission. We'll be back for the second act. I promise." And with that, Freddie Mercury stepped out into the Munich snow, leaving the studio and Queen behind. As the heavy door swung shut, the studio fell into a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the three remaining members of Queen. Brian sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Roger remained standing, staring at the closed door as if Freddie might walk back through it at any moment. John walked to the piano and gently closed the lid over the keys, a gesture that felt symbolic in ways none of them wanted to acknowledge. The engineer who discovered the forgotten tape the next morning would listen to what came after Freddie left. 45 minutes of silence broken only by occasional movement, by the sound of someone crying, by whispered conversations too quiet to fully capture. And then, near the end of the tape, three voices beginning to harmonize on Bohemian Rhapsody, not rehearsing, not performing, just singing because singing was what they did when words failed. Freddie didn't return to the studio for 7 months. During that time, he recorded his first solo album, Mr. Bad Guy, an album that would be critically divisive but personally essential. He explored sounds Queen would never touch, worked with different musicians, made decisions without committee approval. Brian, Roger, and John tried to continue without him, but it felt wrong, like trying to make a car run on 3 wheels. They eventually gave up and pursued their own projects, each man processing the Munich breakdown in his own way. But something unexpected happened during that separation. The anger faded, the exhaustion began to heal, and slowly each member of Queen began to remember why they'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Queen didn't die that night in Munich, but the version of Queen the world knew, the unstoppable, frictionless hit machine, was gone forever. What emerged from the frost of Munich a year later was different. It was humbler. It was harder. It was a band that had looked into the abyss of dissolution and stepped back. A band that had learned that even legends need to be human sometimes. It was the band that would eventually take the stage at Live Aid in July 1985 and deliver what many consider the greatest rock performance in history. 20 minutes of pure, distilled Queen that reminded the world and reminded themselves why they mattered. But they only got there because, for one dark night in a Munich basement in February 1984, Freddie Mercury was brave enough to admit that even a king needs to step down from the throne to remember how to breathe. The tape from that night remains in the archives. The engineer labeled it simply Queen Munich, February 14th, 84, the night the music stopped. It's never been released. Brian, Roger, and the Deacon family, John having retired from public life, have all agreed it should remain private, a moment too raw, too real for public consumption. But for those who were there, for the 3 men who stayed in that studio after Freddie walked out into the snow, the memory of that night remains vivid. "It was the worst night of my life," Brian said in a 2019 interview. But also, strangely, one of the most important, because Freddie was right. We had become machines. We'd forgotten what we were actually doing and why. That night forced us to remember. Roger echoed the sentiment. "When Freddie walked out, I thought Queen was over, finished, but what actually happened was we all got permission to be human instead of legends. And when we came back together, we came back as friends, not just bandmates." The Munich breakdown became Queen's reset button. It gave them permission to evolve, to change, to admit when things weren't working. It broke them down so they could build themselves back up stronger. And it proved something that Freddie had always known but sometimes forgot: that vulnerability isn't weakness. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you need to stop. Tonight the music stops. But silence, it turns out, is just the space where new music begins.